Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I believe we're ready to get started. Thank you for joining North Dakota Native Vote and sharing this very special presentation from Dr. Joseph Robertson regarding the work that we've been doing over the last few months. It is my pleasure to host this event. My name is Nicole Montclair Donaghy. I am the Executive Director for North Dakota Native Vote. And I'm so happy you chose to be with us this evening. So it's 7 o'clock now. We're going to get started now. We will open with introduction from who North Dakota Native Vote is, if you're not familiar with that yet. Then we'll dive into Dr. Robertson's presentation. We do have a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom panel. So anytime you feel like you want to ask a question, go ahead and type that in, and then we'll answer it in a timely manner. And so let's begin. So like I said, my name is Nicole Montclair Donaghy, and welcome to Democratizing North Dakota Voting Data, using data science to study the impact of the gerrymander on the Native vote in North Dakota. We believe wholeheartedly that data is at the root of everything that we do, but being from the communities that we come from, sometimes data isn't always readily available. Data is not shared, and data is very scant and also oversimplified in so many cases when it comes to our Native American communities. And also the last thing I would share is that data is also not free. Getting access to data, you have to know what you're looking for. You have to know the systems to data mine, and that's also often a barrier to many of our organizations. And so it's been a pleasure to work with Dr. Joseph Robertson on the work that we've been doing so far. So let me begin by talking about who is North Dakota Native Vote. So North Dakota Native Vote is an organization that was formed in 2018 in response to the voter identification law that had the ability to disenfranchise over 5,000 Native American voters in North Dakota alone. The law required our voters to have a physical address. Coming from the reservation, growing up in 4-8, we know that we get our mail at the post office rather than being delivered to our house. And so that was a huge problem for our people. This is our staff, Deborah Yellow-Earring, our field director, Donnell Redhorn, our office admin, Jessica Behealer, our communications coordinator, and Charnel Seaboy, our first ever full-time permanent field organizer. And I'm very proud of my staff. All right, so like I said, North Dakota Native Vote began our work during the 2018 midterm election. We worked to counteract the voter identification law that had required our voters to have a physical address on their card. And like I said, it did have the ability to disenfranchise over 5,000 Native American electors. So because of the work that, collective work that North Dakota Native Vote, among others, did in our communities, all of the field organizers, all of the leadership on the ground, we were able to more than double the voter turnout for a midterm election in 2018, and that was the first. Our areas of focus. So North Dakota Native Vote, we are a C4 nonprofit organization, but most of our work is in education. So our work is in education and outreach. Advocacy and civic engagement is our primary purpose. Excuse me. So our issues are voter education and civic engagement, getting people involved in the processes that affect their lives every day, like voting. Voting is very important because you have the ability to choose who's going to represent you and who is going to be making decisions on your behalf. And so we want to inspire all of our relatives to get out and vote, whether it be in the county commission or the state legislature, the presidency. It's always, we always want you to vote. We also work on a political program. So we have the ability to endorse candidates. Sorry, I couldn't remember the word. To endorse candidates, to bring candidates into the political arena, and to support them through their candidacy and get them elected, so that we have that level of representation at every decision level. Excuse me. Some of our more recent work is diving into the rural electric co-op reform here in North Dakota. Rural electric co-ops do have boards of directors that do make decisions on your behalf as an energy consumer, and we should have the ability to help make those decisions or have our perspective as Native people be told in those arenas as well. We also work on federal advocacy. Under the Renewable Energy Access, we believe renewable energy should be a right for all people. Victims' protections, issues that affect tribal sovereignty. A big issue that's come up in our arena is the Inflation Reduction Act. We don't have a full picture of how that's going to affect our communities, but that's something that we're working toward. So what we do, we are a community organizing organization. What that means is we are a bottom-up grassroots field organizing organization. Bottom-up means from the grassroots up to the top. And so meaning we utilize a model called Trusted Faces, Trusted Voices. And so our model is based on utilizing or bringing in and enhancing local leadership so that they have all of the tools that they need to make change in their communities on issues that are important to them. We do information sharing, credible resources, and we disperse them at the local level through our Trusted Faces, Trusted Voices organizers. Our work is data-driven. We are intentionally learning that champions, questioning, reflection, and action directs our stakeholders. And so getting people involved in the process to collect data and then question the results and how that impacts us as a people. Sorry, I have one more slide. All right, so that's a little bit about North Dakota Native Vote. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I am about to hand it off to Dr. Robertson. And so without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Robertson. So Dr. Joseph Robertson is an enrolled member of the Sistan-Waptin Oyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation and is the founder and chief data scientist of Mato Ohitika Analytics, LLC. Mato Ohitika Analytics, LLC provides statistical consulting, data science solutions, and machine learning and artificial intelligence research and development. The company's primary focus is on the role of data-driven decision-making in American tribal government governance using Dr. Robertson's Data Sovereignty Initiative framework. Data science has become the foundation of continuing evolution between how data is actualized and then applied to actual phenomena. The growing body of data sovereignty issues, data ethics principles, and applications of data science concepts exclusive to American Indian tribal communities are culturally unique in that American Indians are governed by over 200 years of federal Indian law and policy, and that today represents significant challenges to tribes' sovereignty and the right to self-determination. Dr. Robertson's data sovereignty framework seeks to democratize data for the community's benefit by responsibly bridging science and culture. Dr. Robertson's work in the grassroots space and broader initiatives covers a wide range of data science topics, such as mapping the Native vote, missing and murdered Indigenous women, mapping the Indian land cessions, and Indigenous AI for language preservation, to name a few. So thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Robertson. I will hand the screen share over to you. Welcome.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Joseph Robertson. Thank you for the introduction, Nicole. I want to thank all you folks for taking a little time out of your evening to come and look and see what some of the work we've been doing here at North Dakota Native Vote on behalf of my company, Mato Ohitika Analytics, LLC. What we were hoping to do today is to give you kind of a general overview of some of the complex work that we've been doing about trying to understand voting. The main story of the work that we're doing is what I'm going to present now. And then we're going to talk a little bit about establishing the basis for understanding Native vote through our history, understanding a little bit about gerrymandering. And then I'd also like to just show you a live demo of how this work is being done in GIS in real time. And so I think it'd be, I hope you'll enjoy the ride. It's can be very overwhelming with all the data we have to, that I've had to like try and figure out how to code and to put into meaningful ways. But I think you really will see just it's really a great partnership between Native Vote and myself and our relatives more broadly about building coalitions to promote democracy. So without a further ado, then of course our name of our presentation is Democratizing North Dakota Voting Data Using Data Science to Study the Impact of Gerrymandering on the Native Vote. So just today's session, I'm just going to give a kind of a brief overview of myself. Of course, I usually do a land acknowledgement. We'll look a little bit at the Data Sovereignty Initiative, the North Dakota Native Vote strategic partnership that we have. We'll look at the project at a glance. We'll talk about some of the philosophy underlying what our partnership is about. And then I wanted to show you some examples of the work that we've produced using data science in the last quarter. So like Nicole said, I'm an enrolled member of the Sistan Waptin Oyate of the Lake Traverse Reservation, Ocheti Shakowin people, Sissetawan Dakota. My education is I hold a Doctor of Philosophy in Computational Science and Statistics and a Master in Statistics from South Dakota State University. I was a highly qualified mathematics teacher, and I taught in the Indian education system here in South Dakota at the Crow Creek Tribal School. I was adjunct at Lower Rural Community College, where I taught college algebra, and then I served as a math coach and upper level mathematics instructor at the Flandre Indian School and was part of their school improvement team. And then I hold a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Colorado State University. I've been asked in the last probably year and a half to weigh in on how to understand land acknowledgements and what are they and what exactly do they do. So for those folks that are not familiar with our people, we have 9 federally recognized tribes in the state of South Dakota. This map I created to give everybody a view of what the reservation system looks like. Obviously, these are the names of the reservations and not necessarily the names of our tribal nations, but I'm from Lake Traverse Reservation and I'm enrolled at Old Agency. So historically, the Native Americans that comprise the Great Sioux Nation consist of 3 divisions of the Ocheti Shakowin, or 7 council fires, which include the Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota people. The Dakota people are comprised of the Sissetawan, Wakapetawan, Wakapetute, and the Medewa-Kantawan, and are the oldest of the 3 divisions. The Nakota people are comprised of the Hanktawan and the Hanktawana, and then the Lakota are comprised of the Titawan, and they have 7 subdivisions of Oshpayes that are subdivisions of that council fire. Since the inception of the Indian Appropriations Act, many of the Dakota people have called Lake Traverse home. Here's an example of a land acknowledgement I did when I gave a keynote at the University of North Carolina School of Data Science, their data science conference. And so the school did an acknowledgement for the first time when I was asked to deliver a keynote. So I produced a map for that. This map is a map of one of the Indian land cessions from up in North Dakota. And if you're not familiar with the land cessions, there's a set of maps that were drawn in the late 1800s that pretty much organized how all the land was either chopped up or done by treaty or through executive order of Congress. And so this map represents a way for us to look at the history of that and to map that, and then we do some trainings with that. And so this was a map I brought to Turtle Mountain when I went to visit for North Dakota Native Vote's board meeting just maybe a month or 2 ago. And so I was able to take that up and show it and talk with the folks that live up there. So I want to talk just briefly about the work that I do from this framework, this Data Sovereignty Initiative. And it's a framework that I designed for my doctoral work from my dissertation, The Impact of Data Sovereignty on American Indian Self-Determination, a Framework Proof of Concept Using Data Science. And the Data Sovereignty Initiative is essentially a collection of methods and concepts as a way to responsibly bridge science and culture. The design of the initiative is to provide an interdisciplinary system of analytical theories built using data science that intersects culture, nation building, higher education, pedagogical design, and at its heart is really citizen science. And so it continues to establish a new praxis in understanding American Indian tribal sovereignty through the concept of data sovereignty. So these are the simple designs I made for the key indicators that I designed that were cultural and scientific in nature. And so because they're cultural and scientific, I had to design a way to create a way where we could collect data in some meaningful way, where we establish the idea that we keep culture and the science as two mutually exclusive things. They do overlap, but as a general rule, what we're trying to do is figure out a way where we can bridge these things together in meaningful ways and not have one or the other move in and make judgments or things about the culture or the science that are maybe inappropriate in our thinking, in our culture. And then there are interdisciplinary, the ideas of using data science and citizen science to actualize all this data that we collect, and how do you do that meaningful? It's a very tough question to ask. So essentially, this was just kind of the whole idea that if we carefully interlock all of these around a data domain, so for instance, how do we democratize data for native vote? And then we pair all of this data collection by integrating the cultural, scientific, and interdisciplinary methods of design and consultation is what kind of forms what we call a smart solution. And so my company defines data sovereignty as in the context of nation building, which is the application and use of data to leverage a data-driven outcome as a strategic act of sovereignty. So American Indian tribes are the only ethnic group in the US with the sovereign status that's governed by that 200 years of case law and Supreme Court decisions. And so what this really means is that when data infrastructure, like I'm going to show you here in this presentation, is created using this DSI framework, then we have these ideas of strategic planning, business intelligence, data collection and practice are the drivers for not only the ownership of that data, but strategic management of that data to act in a highly probabilistic way of affecting a policy outcome. So for instance, getting people out to vote, or studying the gerrymandering of how native vote may be diluted or maybe cracked or packed in different districts. So from this perspective, tribal sovereignty is a governing action unique to American Indian tribes, and that's realized in many abstract and concrete ways in governance. Data science outlines a dynamic and multi-dimensional way to actualize phenomena with data. And the data sovereignty the framework is designed to use data science to affect, again, highly probabilistic outcomes in policy. And then data sovereignty needs to utilize high ethical standards to have data work for marginalized communities through nation building. And these ethical standards have to be built into these systems through intelligence gathering and community consultation. So it's not so easy just to decide that what the ethics are afterwards. You have to do it right when you're doing it and working with the communities. So the strategic partnership began late in 2021 between my company and North Dakota Native Vote. And so we were introduced through another grassroots partner. And then after a number of strategic conversations, North Dakota Native Vote asked me to assist in their campaign in understanding the Native vote in North Dakota. And so some of the initial ideas for the project were developing pilot maps for some of the new districts that were drawn in 2020, census as split districts with an at-large district containing American Indian reservations throughout North Dakota, developing methods to code and democratize data in order to tell stories about voting and census information related to voter turnout. Some of the initial ideas of this project were really, we didn't really know what exactly we wanted to do with some of this information, but here were some of the ideas of maybe developing policy level intelligence for advocacy, communication with county commissions on the types of precinct and county level data available for analysis. And I'll show some of that here in a little bit. Developing rural landscapes and analyses such as polling stations, transportation routes, precinct locations, and to assist in a broader pledge to vote for the 2022 and 2024 elections. And then finally, to create a data collection system to track voter data and utilize data in strategic decision-making throughout the project in real time. And of course, since there are no voter rolls in North Dakota, that's obviously a very challenging thing that Nicole shared with me. So, there's no way to really figure out who's voting until somebody goes to the polls. So the key impending issues that we had were really how quickly can these solutions be created to reflect outcomes in the 2022 North Dakota primary. So I've got some examples of the GIS data integration of ballots cast and voter turnout from the primary to see exactly what's happening there. What are the strategies to assist in telling stories about the importance of voting and participating in democracy? And we'll have a little bit more about that, about the history of Native vote here in a little bit as well. Understand the impact of gerrymandering within the American Indian reservation boundaries as they stand from the 2020 census, and then how to tell stories in meaningful ways to American Indian communities in North Dakota. And so we've developed a story map that we want to present today as well. So how to develop and then finally, how to develop a comprehensive long-term strategic plan to develop AI, not American Indian, artificial intelligence, machine learning techniques to confront settler colonialism and its constructs for truth-telling about our shared history in this country. So one of the things that Nicole and I really came to agree on is that for us as Oceti-Sakowin people and just as relatives in general, that we've always had a primary philosophy of restructuring our kinship systems to provide the underlying framework for shared governance and professional development through our cultural knowledge systems. And so one of the things that a lot of folks don't understand is if you don't understand that these knowledge systems and the protocols, it's very difficult to really understand what angles to take in talking with community members or even introducing yourself to the community. And so this is just some of the work that Ella Deloria and Haktuan Dakota back in the early 1900s talked a little bit about how the kinship systems are put together. And what they did is they were first for survival, and then she writes more about how these protocols also evolved through the colonialism and the assimilation tactics as the country was being founded. But nevertheless, we still are bound to those types of kinship and perspectives. And so we are jointly trying to use that as a matter of connecting our people back to these belief systems, and that these are what make us who we are. And so here's just a couple of things that she wrote about the Dakota kinship systems. Is one must obey the kinship rules and be a good relative. Every other consideration was secondary to being a good relative, and to be a good Dakota then was to be human and civilized. And civilized was to keep the rules imposed by kinship for achieving civility, good manners, and a sense of responsibility towards everyone, every individual dealt with. And that, of course, extended to blood and marriage, adoption, and also social kinship. One other thing I wanted to just mention is this idea of what we're doing together is kind of a way for us to do kind of a giving to have philosophy, where you give to have as a matter of our shared kinship. So part of what the philosophy here is that the research and development I do as a technical data science company is being produced to help benefit our communities, and that we're giving parts of that to have our communities benefit from the work that we do, but we keep that as a way to help us kind of see where there are places where we come together, and there are other places where I'm still working on more advanced solutions to help kind of unify data in Indian country in very specific ways. But what she really spoke in her book in regard to kinship and generosity is really at the foundation of our partnership. And that she writes in the book, Speaking of Indians, the danger in explaining to outsiders this principle of giving to have is that it might appear as nothing more than a barter system. But really it was much finer than that. It had warmth and cordiality. The spirit was gracious. It was the very essence of Dakota communal life. And if it were to stop suddenly for any reason, those who lived by it would be a lost people, a people without their bearings. And so this giving system certainly was not for enriching oneself at the expense of others. And so we always make that as a mindful commitment to us and the work that we do, and the work we do on behalf of our people, as a matter of that honoring that kinship, and that we're doing this for our communities, not just for ourselves. So I'm just going to go through a few slides of the project at a glance. So essentially, we've got these different stages of developments that can be outlined here. First, we were developing narratives about the history and current outcomes of Native disenfranchisement as a result of the North Dakota state history and gerrymandering, developing maps for strategic decision-making, developing story maps to educate the communities about their right to vote and provide trainings in gerrymandering, studying Indian land cessions, power analysis, and mapping in real time the primary vote as it relates to the general election here in November. And then finally developing an extensive database, calculations related to the 2020 census, and redistricting and studying metrics of the current gerrymander around American Indian reservations. So here's some examples of some of the work that I have produced on behalf of the project. This is a map of District 4, and as you can see, District 4 has been divided from the redistricting into two smaller districts, 4A and 4B. We'll see in a minute, but essentially 4A is the boundaries of the Fort Berthold Reservation, and then this upper part right here is the other part, and then that is combined as an at-large district for the upper house in the Senate for the state of North Dakota and their legislature. So prior to this, there wasn't really much that folks could show me about this, so we had to build this from the ground up. So it was our first conversation of producing a map to really have some new conversations about looking at compactness and just basically looking at the districts from how they were drawn from the census. I'm going to show you here in a little bit also some examples of this work that I've produced using data science. This is part of the Using Data Science to Remaster the Past, Understanding Our Shared History initiative, where the land sessions that I've been digitally remastering the language and the maps that were drawn in the 1800s from the Bureau of Ethnology's Part 2 report to the Secretary of the Smithsonian. Because I think what we really need to understand is that in a settler colonial construct, the land is what is really is the thing that matters the most. And so I think it was always important to gain some mastery about where did our land go and how. So this is one of the remasters of just giving you a good idea of the land cessions and how they are cataloged inside the Bureau of Ethnology's report to the Secretary of the Smithsonian. I found it pretty shocking that most of North Dakota was seized with no agreement, that red part. I couldn't find any evidence in there that any of that was taken for and negotiated in any way with the indigenous people here. Here's an example of some of the trainings I also do to accompany the work that we're doing here. This is a blank map, actually. And on the right-hand side here, you'll see that it's small writing, but essentially what it is these are the ledger of the land cessions that came out of that report. And so these have direct meets and bounds that say, hey, if you go here, go over here, go down here, this is the treaty of, let's say, Traverse des Sioux, or this is the treaty of Mendota, or or this was just a land cession done by Congress. And so the challenge here, which I think the folks at North Dakota Native Vote found out, is it's not as easy as you might think. And so what we do is we work on trying to understand the land cessions to establish this knowledge base for the folks that are from the areas in North Dakota. So as you can see, here are some of the drawings that are very complex. And let me tell you, they weren't easy to draw from the actual meets and bounds that are on the right-hand side. So it really is a big challenge to do that, but it's very valuable to help us better understand how these things, how the land cessions tie to this gerrymandering work as well, because it does. This is a map of the 2020 redistricting. And so what we set out to do is to first look at the two split districts of 4A and 4B, and then look at District 31, where Sioux County splits. Half of Sioux County is the Standing Rock Reservation, and the other part is in South Dakota. And so we were just developing these ideas of where the voting districts come from the US Census. And I'll comment a little bit more about that later, but it tends to, with the precinct level reporting that comes from the election, we found a lot of unique challenges to understanding how you would track native vote. This is something we'll show you here in a little bit. The story map of deciding and talking about do we have free and fair elections? And so I have two senior research associate contributors that work on behalf of my company, and they helped me put together this story map for helping to educate our folks about what does it mean as far as the cost of voting living in a rural community. And so I'll go over a little bit about that here towards the end. But again, we're developing digital infrastructure that helps us look and see how we can tell powerful stories using a lot of the technology we have. This is some of the other training work that I do in helping folks understand spatial like dimensionality and understanding that there's their body of work that was done back in the early 2000s about understanding three-dimensional power analysis and to create a dimensional idea of how do you bridge the tribal community and grassroots, understand tribal governance, and understand this idea of how the state has jurisdiction over certain areas within the state and how that affects the power that people have in participating in democracy. This was a map that we created for another part of the training, which was allowing the staff to look and see where all the voting districts are in North Dakota, how they're designed and aligned. And what we essentially did is I pulled all the primary data that had voting districts in it. And so the task was to figure out where the numbers go in each one of those boxes by district. This was another map that we put together, and this is part of that story map, is this example of the work produced by using data science. This map is a route analysis. And so what we did is we just did a simple route analysis from Solon, one of the communities in and around in Sioux County, and the Porcupine community, and then did kind of a cost analysis of about what a free and fair election looks like. And that the driving time and the gas at the time when we were hitting that major inflationary point just a few months ago, that per 100 voters, it was going to cost on election day, if you had to drive there per 100 voters, it's going to be $1,200 based on that current price per gallon. So kind of the whole idea here is to talk about, is it a free and fair election? And if you have to go to the post office to mail your ballot in anyway, and there's no drop off and you have to drive to the post office and right where the courthouse is, then you're still doing double duty on trying to get your ballot turned in. This is one of the maps that we created from the primary results, I believe. And then we designed and looked at what are the matchups for the Native candidates in the race for November. And so this was the work of 9A and 9B up towards the Turtle Mountain community. And so again, these are just informational maps that allow us to look at the voters from kind of a macro level, and then we keep kind of zooming down in to see what we can find. I just wanted to produce some of this. This is some of the block code I had to write in order to capture the data from the Secretary of State's website, and then to re-engineer it in a way where we could create a data integration into the geographic information systems, or the GIS systems and software that we use to produce maps. And so it's taken quite a bit of development of looking at how do you create operational and democratized coding in order to kind of put the data into a place where people that can't do this have a way to actually make that voting data democratized. This is something, if we get to, this is one of the other analyses that we did, is looking at the Secretary of State maintains a website of each one of the counties that draw their own voting precincts. And the bottom picture here is the actual voting districts that come from the US Census. And so my team basically put together a way for us to look and compare the voting precinct maps with the actual reported results. And it actually turned out that many of these precincts are very, it's very troublesome because some of them aren't reported the way they are according to the voting districts. And so very challenging problem to try and solve. This is something else that I'm going to be releasing probably tomorrow on my company website, bravebearanalytics.com, is some work that I did with a Tufts student, an undergraduate, who I've been working with over the last year and a half. And he he worked on behalf of my company for my 2022 summer internship program, where he developed this democratizing South Dakota voting data for gerrymandering analysis. And so one of the amazing things about this is that we were doing that in parallel to the work we were doing with Native Vote. And so we were getting a number of different perspectives on understanding, like, for instance, here's an example of some of the work he did in studying the compactness scores for South Dakota legislative districts, which is what I'll show you a little bit of what we're doing this evening as well. So his paper, the paper that he submitted, was just an exemplary piece of how our young people, when you give them a task of formulating an idea and a hypothesis or research statement and giving them the tools and the support, that they really produce exemplary work. And so this is, again, another part of the broader initiative of community development, nation building with academics as well. And so, we have to have diverse sets of people working on behalf of our communities, because that's just the way it has to be. We have to stay diversified. So we're having our representative folks giving our thoughts and kind of advice to us as we do this work. And then finally, here's some of the additional work that was produced. And these are the districts. And then these are some of the geometries that are tied to gerrymandering. This is a convex hull polygon. And so the score is a ratio of usually the areas of these things. And so it kind of gives us an idea of whether or not is this district been gerrymandered or not. And so a lot of these pieces here, these compactness scores, were all done by my team. I've got two contributors, Julia Weil and Ellen Martin, that have been producing a lot of these polygons for us to better understand the scoring and what does it actually mean. And so finally, here, our future work on building voting infrastructure. Okay, again, like, a lot of this work is just like happening in real time. So like, there's no way to like stop it really, except for kind of designing what are we going to do next. We've got 70 some days till the election, and so what are we going to do in the meantime? So some of the work that we're thinking about is developing additional story maps to educate the public on the gerrymandering work, continue to mapping voting outcomes at the nearest demographic level, track voter engagement with systems that have been developed, seeking further funding for developing an advanced voting analysis model for all of Indian country to target voters in rural communities. And then finally, to build collective strategic partnerships that strengthen the democratic process. And of course, that's what this is all about, is helping us better understand our shared history as Native people and the difficulties we've faced since the beginning of the founding of the country. And being First Nations people means that we have to examine that in the context of how we approach getting people to engage in participating in our democracy and in our own tribal elections. So that kind of concludes our first part. That's kind of gives you a general overview of the work that we're doing. And so I will maybe hand it over to Nicole, and maybe we can just chat a little bit about some of the things that we saw in the presentation.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Robertson. So much information and so done in such short amount of time. So how long did this project been going? We've been working, what, 4 months?
Yeah, we've been working 4 months. Yeah, and that is a testament to not only getting organized and knowing what you wanted, but also knowing that there was, like, I've already been kind of working on that. This has been kind of a passion of mine as far as making sure that we are participating in democracy. And so it took a lot of code writing on the front end, but now that we're kind of getting some of this work established, I can only foresee that for the long term that we can develop even more amazing things for people to see and interact with.
So a lot of this work stems from the decennial census that happens every 10 years in our country. So can you elaborate a little bit on how the census affects the legislative redistricting and how the legislative redistricting affects our our ability to vote and where we're going to vote and who we're going to vote for.
Yeah, of course. I think one of the things I'll present here shortly is in the history of Native vote. Of course, gerrymandering has been around since like 1800s. So in the context of the census, some of the history I'm going to go over is talking about the construction in the Constitution of the United States about the Electoral College, and that the Electoral College was designed with this idea that they had shifted the idea from land to population as a matter of designing and talking about taxation on the state level that indicated the level of wealth for each state that was originally in those 13 the 13 colonies and then the first 13 states. And so they ordered that every 10 years there'd be a census done. And so throughout history, the census has been a way of reapportionment. And I'll talk a little bit later about the 3/5 rule, but originally in the founding of the Republic, the South didn't have enough representation. So they were taking the counts of blacks that were slaves and using that in order to gain legislative seats in the House of Representatives because they didn't have a good enough population. But more importantly, tied to the census is that every 10 years you have to put together and see how many people live in your state, and then they go out and canvass, and so a lot of the census work that comes out of that. Well, what I did is I pulled all the census data from 2020, and there's about 103,000 lines and probably 50 or 60 variables that represent everything that you can imagine. I mean, it's so robust that it's not easily accessible for people. But what the census really, why we need to pay attention to that, because in the gerrymandering concept, especially back in 2010 and leading up to 2020, is the GOP was really working very hard to develop and get those state legislatures captured in order to be able to draw the boundaries. And so what I think, Nicole, when we did the training up at Turtle Mountain taught us is that even a minority in these in the district drawing process, even the minority, if they were given the power to do that, could gerrymander a minority rule and majority vote by geography. And so that's why the census is so important. The census is number one important because if you're not participating in the census, some of the other folks that were working on census in 2020, we went to a training here in Pierce, South Dakota, right before COVID hit, and we were talking about that each family is counted at $3,000 a person, and if you look at that over 10 years, that's 30,000 in federal funding that goes to our communities. So if our community is only, let's say our community is 1,000 people and 30 people take the census, we're taking 30,000 times that other 500 people that didn't, or the 700 people out of 1,000 that didn't take the census. That's lost revenue for our communities. And it's in fact lost revenue for states too. And so that's why it's so important to understand that the structural nature of our Constitution and the democracy we live in is that it requires you to maintain your civic duty, not only as a citizen of your own nation, but as a citizen of the United States, to maintain some level of participation in that, because those are dollars that we're directly not getting for lack of participation. And then finally, the whole census about related to gerrymandering is that every 10 years, the state legislatures are given the power through the Constitution to redraw those boundaries after a census has been done. And so it's good. What's important about that is that in 8 years from now, it's like it's going to happen again. So are we going to be ready to understand that those census numbers, when we participate and then they come back, that's what the legislature uses to draw those districts. So if we're undercounted and underrepresented, we're at a huge disadvantage. And so that's really why some of this conversation we're having this evening and in the future is really linking and tying all these data points together to see why it's so important that it's not just go out and vote.
That's right. It's all interconnected. So what was some of like the biggest surprises that you've learned about North Dakota and our voting process and our elections from the data that you filed?
I think one of the, well, I was just looking on the Secretary of State's website in South Dakota, and I think you're able to obtain a copy of the voter rolls for analysis. But for North Dakota, it's my understanding that there is no voter registration. So it's hard to like figure out who's voting where and how and when. And so some of the biggest challenges I saw is that when you connect the county commission precinct level voting information from the primary data that we did, and then trying to compare that to the voting districts of the census. So for all of you that out there that don't know, that the US Census Bureau provides what we call shape files, and they're polygons that we can put into a GIS software system to represent boundaries of the state, the Indian reservations. And one of them is that they've developed voting districts that are polygons that are supposedly kind of the base of the voting districts, but these counties also have the power to draw their own precincts for the vote. And so I found it just really, really interesting that it was tough to really find a lot of that information. You really had to like go for it and look for it, or you had to ask the right question. So I thought we're still at this point where we can't integrate a lot of the voting data quite yet because of some of the discrepancies, and in some systems match up and some of them don't. And so, but again, part of what we're trying to figure out is that this is like a nonpartisan type of look at of the voting. So what we're really trying to do is ask really intelligent questions about, how do we improve the systems here so natives have their representation fully embraced in your state, in North Dakota.
That's right. We do not have voter registration in North Dakota, and we at Native Vote really don't support the notion of having voter registration until we can remove all the stumbling blocks that we face already as Native people to obtain the ability to vote, whether it be voter ID laws or durational residency laws, which are very unconstitutional. Our state legislature last session had 27 bills, I want to say. There was over 20 bills that were proposed that would have reformed our state elections. And so, yeah, we're in a really trying time in our history as people, with our ability to vote. So how was it obtaining the information and finding the census rolls? Was it a difficult process, or, to somebody like me, I wouldn't know what I'm looking for if I was to take on a project like this. So what was the process like for you?
I think one of the best ways I can explain it is I was on a tribal consultation with the US Census just a couple weeks ago, and there were many folks from different grassroots communities that were showing some of the examples of their work. And there are tools in the US Census where you can go out and you can download all sorts of different things that were related to some of the work that people are trying to do and use data in a meaningful way and to map things. But what I really did find out is the US Census really does their homework, and they do have scripts and codes that allow you to actually manipulate the data, or to actually pull all of the census data into, like, let's say, a statistical software system, which by my training, I've been coding for, over a decade. So being able to solve these really highly complex problems of, let's say, if I give you a data set that has 100,000 lines on it, how are you going to be able to capture the 10 things you need out of that 100,000 lines without having to manually go through all of those things? And so it is, so there's kind of two camps here. Is the census makes it available for kind of non-coding folks that can use the interface, the web interface, to get some specific information, either from the American Community Survey or from just the pure census results from 2020 or 2010. But what I found is that in order to really pair the census data with geographic information systems, which is where our being able to locate where our people are living, what does the census say about where we're living, required a great deal of writing code to do that. And so that's a really huge research and development activity that we need to do in order to find a way to democratize that data, so you have a better understanding of what you have when we capture that data. And so we're kind of I think we're still in that introductory space where I'm trying to help the community better understand that there's lots of data out there, but it's a whole different story to try and unlock it. So it's just a work in progress of writing the right code for the right task.
Talking about data democracy, what does that mean to you as an Indigenous person, data democracy?
Well, I've really looked at the idea. The data sovereignty initiative is really the basis for my company's ethos. And like the dissertation I wrote was really supposed to be a living document. Like I would go and gather intelligence in the communities and then design solutions specifically for whatever task or whatever need is needed. The tech sector, I've always kind of joked about, is they've come full circle now where they're creating systems in search of problems. And so that doesn't really work for us because we can't, as people, have somebody design something outside of our own consultation to make it work for what it is that we might need it for, whether it's climate change, whether it's voting, whether it's MMIW, whether it's fighting against pipelines. Operationally, this data has a couple of components to it. Number one is democratizing data for the community's benefit is part of our kinship system if we look at it from the lens of citizen science, where we can teach folks on the ground to utilize these technologies to democratize data. But there's the other aspect is understanding the data ethics part about it. It's like, just because you democratize data doesn't mean you should release it to your adversary for them to be able to reverse engineer what it is you're trying to do in your campaign. So there's this ethics point where it's like, how do you decide on shared governance? And so democratizing data has a number of different things that you need to consider before you just say, okay, we did this for our community, now here you go. It's like, is that productive to the conversation or the campaign that you're running? It could be, but I tend to think that, like, being in this space and having this expertise, that it's not just easy to say, well, we're just gonna get some data and give it over to someone. As you can see, it really is a lot more involved than that. And that's why we have these conversations, because democratizing data is it's a very high level idea. And so it's a big top kind of thing, but it's much different when we start designing solutions just for Native Vote and what that looks like.
So let's talk a little bit about, if you're prepared, the idea of one person, one vote, and how that relates to voting.
One of the things is, if we think about one person, one vote, I think what I'd like to do is maybe, well, the idea of one person, one vote is actually a relatively new kind of thing. It's like, what I would like to do first is to, I'll talk about a little bit about this, and I've got two kind of quick fire presentations that are kind of help us better understand the history of the Native vote and history of voting. And then that will help us transition to a few slides I have about gerrymandering. And so then we can kind of bring that back around into this whole project that you're working on. And again, it's like this interdisciplinary idea of putting these things all together probably seems pretty crazy to some people on the outside. But I can assure you that when we're doing this to create outcomes for our community, education is really at the heart of this, that we need to develop educational strategies for our folks. And, being an educator over all these years, that's really the primary focus I do in developing trainings and conversations about these things. So we're going to look at the history of the Native voting in the United States of America from 1788 to 2022. And so the question is, what's the actual history of the right to vote in the United States? And if any of you folks have any comments about that or anything, I'm interested to know, how far have we dug into our Constitution and the things that we do? So the first thing I wanted to just mention is, of course, the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. We've all probably seen this, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I was looking, just doing some research about this, and of course, I don't think it was ratified. Scholars agree that it was ratified on August 2nd. So they finished the draft on July 4th, but maybe the 2nd of August wasn't a good tagline for the birth date of our country. Of course, the Constitution was created in September 17th, 1787, and ratified on June 1st, 1788. So as you can see, in 1776, it's like this was the Declaration of Independence. It took until 1878 to actually hold an election. So again, the Constitution became effective in March 4th, 1789. The Constitution's first 10 amendments are considered to be the Bill of Rights. The Constitution has been amended 27 times. The majority of the 17 later amendments expand individual civil rights protections. And then, of course, they're in the original, there were 7 articles, and the separation of powers are contained in Article 1, 2, and 3, where we have Congress, the executive, and the judicial branches of government. Here's an example. Here's a list of the year in 1788. There were 43,000 popular votes, and it looks like George Washington won 69 out of 138 electoral votes. So that kind of, what I did is I applied some data science to some of the elections, and we're going to look at that real quick. So the first thing I wanted to just look at is in the 3/5 compromise as part of Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution. Now, Section 2 of the 14th Amendment that was passed in 1868 later superseded this clause, but it explicitly repealed the compromise of this 3/5. And so as you can see, the history of us as Native people here, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned amongst several states, which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound for service for a term of years, okay, i.e. slavery, and then excluding Indians, not taxed 3/5 of all persons. So basically the compromise they had in that convention was that the southern states didn't have enough non-white people, or didn't have enough white people to be represented in the electoral college. So they came up with this compromise of counting 3/5 of the slaves, which obviously were property. So the 3/5 ratio originated from the amendment proposed to the Articles of Confederation on April 18th, 1783. The amendment was to have changed the basis for determining the wealth of each state, and hence its tax obligations from real estate to population as a measure of ability to produce wealth. And the proposal by a committee of Congress had suggested that, quote, taxes shall be supplied by the several colonies in proportion to the number of inhabitants of every age, sex, and quality, except Indians not paying taxes. So there again is the not paying, the Indian, that us as people were disenfranchised from voting, like right off the bat. The South immediately objected to this formula since it would include slaves who were viewed as primarily as property, and in calculating the amount of taxes to be paid. So that brings me to the 14th Amendment. In 1868, the 14th Amendment declared all persons born or naturalized in the United States was subject to the jurisdiction and thereof were citizens. But however, the jurisdiction requirement was interpreted to exclude most Native Americans, and in the 1870s, the Senate Judiciary Committee further clarified that the matter that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution has no effect whatsoever upon the status of Indian tribes within the limits of the United States. About 8% of the native population at the time qualified for U.S. citizenship because they were taxed, quote taxed. So they had to give up being Indian to get citizenship. Otherwise, others obtained citizenship by serving in the military, marrying whites, or accepting the allotments under the Dawes Act. But more importantly, if you just look at this legacy, like the 14th Amendment, when we think about it, we don't think about the fact that there was exclusionary principles in there, especially to our people. And This was further endowed in the exclusion of Native people from citizenship, which was further established by Elk versus Wilkins in 1884. The Supreme Court held that a Native person born a citizen of a recognized tribal nation was not born an American citizen and did not become one simply by voluntarily leaving his tribe and settling among whites. The syllabus of the decision explained that the Native person, quote, who has not been naturalized or taxed or recognized as a citizen either by the United States or by the state is not a citizen of the United States within the meaning of the first section of the 14th article of amendment of the Constitution. So again, here's one of the first evidences of Natives trying to exercise their vote and being denied to do so. And Elk versus Wilkins was a landmark decision in respect to the citizen status of Indians. And John Welk, a Winnebago Indian, was born on an Indian reservation within the territorial boundaries of the United States. He later resided off reservation in Omaha, Nebraska, where he renounced his formal tribal allegiance, claimed birthright citizenship by virtue of the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. The case came about after Elk tried to register to vote on April 5th, 1880. So here's at least one instance that somebody tried to vote in 1880. But as it turns out, he was denied by Charles Wilkins, the named defendant, who is the registrar of voters in the 5th Ward in the city of Omaha. So voter suppression 101. And it went to the Supreme Court. So as it turns out, the Supreme Court at the time, in a 7-2 decision, ruled that even though Elk was born in the United States, he was not a citizen because he owed allegiance to his tribe when he was born rather than to the United States, and therefore was not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States when he was born. The United States Congress later enacted the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which established citizenship for Indians previously excluded by the Constitution. Though rendered undebatable for its application to Native Indians by this law, the majority opinion offered by the court in this case remains valid for interpretation for future citizenship issues regarding the 14th Amendment. So the First Nations people who have Aboriginal title to this land were not made citizens at all, were deemed and ruled according to the government. Right, just very ironic. So the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 was Congress conferred citizenship upon all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the US, right? But the Electoral College gives the power of states to grant citizenship to people. So this really didn't do much at the time, but it being enacted that Senate and House of Representatives assembled that the non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the US be there and hereby declared to be citizens of the United States, that granting such citizenship shall not in any manner impair otherwise affect the right of Indian to tribal or other property. And so again, 1924 is when citizenship came around. And so I'm not going to go over these, but I will just list them that prior to that passage, here are all the conditional ways that Indians could get citizenship, either through treaty provision, under the Allotment Act, issuing a patent in fee simple, or hey, adopting habits of civilized life, minor or being a minor children, citizenship by birth, soldiers and sailors, marriage, or a special act of Congress. So just to finish up a little quick fire here, here's a picture from the history.com of Native people attempting to vote circa 1948. And so when did we get technically, collectively, the technical right to vote was 1962. The right to vote is considered a fundamental right within our democracy. However, Native Americans, the fight to obtain voting rights is couched with a long history of racism and struggle. When the 14th Amendment passed in 1866, many of all persons born in the United States on Indian reservations were specifically excluded. And there were pragmatic reasons beyond racism to keep Native Americans from voting because their large numbers at the time would have wielded significant political power. And so again, despite these victories, Natives had to fight for it state by state. And of course, despite these victories, Native people were still prevented from voting by poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation, the same tactics used against Black voters. So just to finish up, I wanted to give you a look at the Declaration of the Constitution of North Dakota, passed in November 2nd, 1889. We, the people of North Dakota, gratefully to the Almighty God for this blessing of civil and religious liberty, do ordain and establish this Constitution, that all men are by nature equal, free, and independent, and have certain inalienable rights, among which those of enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property and reputation. There's the settler colonial construct, and then pursuing and obtaining safety and happiness. However, in section 121, it states that every male of the age of 21 years or upwards belonging to either the following classes, who shall resided in the state 1 year, in county 6 months, in the precinct 90 days next preceding any election, shall be deemed a qualified elector at the election. So first, you had to be a citizen. Second, if you're a person of foreign birth who shall have declared their intention to become citizens between 1 and 6 years. But then here's the third one. So civilized persons of Indian descent who shall have severed their ties with their tribal relations 2 years, okay, next preceding such an election. So that was deemed on the books to prevent natives from voting. So that was the third provision in that clause. On June 24th of 1958, that during the civil rights era, that they removed that constitutional language, which restricted the rights to Indian vote. So what I wanted to do as the kind of the piece here in understanding our history is to just look at a few numbers, right? Let's look at the presidential elections at a glance. So the number of federal elections, presidential, since 1788 until 2020, there have been 59 presidential elections. The number of federal elections prior to the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, there are 35 elections, or 59% of all elections of this country's history happened prior to Indians that Indians under the law were given citizenship. So that means that on the other side of it, there are 24 presidential elections since 1924. So natives technically have been, that opportunity window is about 41% of all elections in the nation's history. The number of federal elections after the Indian Citizenship Act until North Dakota amendment to the Constitution to permit American Indians to vote, there were 9 subsequent elections that the state didn't grant American Indians the right to vote until 1958. And so the number of federal elections since North Dakota adopted the state constitution in 1889, there's 33. So that represents, since 1889, about North Dakota has participated in half of the federal presidential elections since the country's founding. And so, more importantly, the number of federal elections after the North Dakota amendment to the Constitution to permit American Indians to vote has been from 1956 to 2020, there have been 17 elections. So the number of years from the first presidential election until North Dakota amended their constitution in 1958 to give the right to vote was 170 years. Okay, the age of the US in 1788 is 234 years. Therefore, the percent of election disenfranchisement since the founding of the country represents about 72% of this country's age. And probably more importantly and more shocking is that the number of elections that I've participated in since then, I've participated in my lifetime in 8 presidential elections. And the number of elections that I've participated in since 1958 represents half of all technical opportunities to vote since North Dakota changed their constitution. And I can't even remember whether or not my grandfather or grandmother even mentioned that they even got to go to the polls back then. I wasn't really thinking about that, but isn't that kind of that's a pretty amazing stat if you ask me.
Amazing. I remember when my parents would go vote, they were like really excited, but like I'm the youngest of 12. And so, there was a big difference in age between my oldest and me. So like my parents, were born in the 30s and they were, really excited when it was time to go vote. So I've learned that from them. Anyway, so thank you so much for sharing that information. It's amazing. Looking at North Dakota, I mean, I'm sure you did some study on the voting story in North Dakota as well.
Yeah, well, what I found is that there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, I it was hard to find any real documented cases of things just kind of off a general search on the internet. So I really had to go to the Constitution and look up and read the Constitution of North Dakota to understand that there's reasons for that. Again, if it wasn't until 1958, we're talking about the civil rights era is when most people of color were given some sort of right to vote. And so prior to that, they weren't even thinking about it. And so, and even if they were, it's like the ideas of how people decide to govern themselves in these states. You saw I've got a in the Indian land cessions idea, where some of these lands were just kind of seized without any sort of agreement. It's like it kind of plays back to that idea of how do we know what the land cessions look like? What were the treaties signed? How do they relate to the current reservations as they are? And then how has that been kind of on autopilot for the last like 50 years? I think you mentioned, and we talked about that when Heidi Heitkamp was elected as a Democrat to the Senate in 2012, North Dakota didn't hesitate once to like put in that voter disenfranchisement law about the PO boxes that immediately disenfranchised the native vote, which was, part of why Heidi Heitkamp was able to get elected through that power, that native vote. And that's something that you've had to fight for, I believe, since then, and you're still fighting it. And so again, you can see that these are not really things that were like fighting and protesting 150 years ago. Like this is like brand new within 17 elections that all this stuff is, that we need to chronicle that because it's really, really quite interesting. If you think about that history from this perspective, from 1958 until now is a different era than it was prior to that, 170 years before that. And so we're going to look at the ideas of the basics of gerrymandering. And so I wanted to just cover a couple of topics to help people kind of frame this idea. What exactly is settler colonialism? Who is Hoffeller and his redistricting strategy? And then talk a little bit about gerrymandering. How does it affect the native vote? And then why are these things important for democracy? So this is the kind of the three-part piece. The project itself, looking at the history of the native vote, not only just collectively as a country, but as a state in North Dakota, and then looking at the gerrymandering analysis that we've been undertaking. In Tuck and Yank's paper, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, I just wanted to mention just a couple things about this, because we have to understand from an academic standpoint some of the fundamentals of what settler colonialism is and why it's important for us to also understand this context. And so they define settler colonialism that operates through these internal and external colonial modes simultaneously, because there's no spatial separation between the metropole and colony, i.e. taking indigenous and extracting things from the culture, like spices or things, or the everyday occupation on the external. So for instance, many indigenous people like us have been forcibly removed from our homelands onto reservation, indentured, abducted into state custody, signaling the form of colonization as simultaneously internal via boarding schools and other biopolitical modes of control, and external via uranium mining on indigenous lands in the US Southwest, or oil extraction on the indigenous lands in Alaska, or with a frontier that the US military still nicknames all enemy territory Indian country. And so the horizons of settler colonial nation state are total and require a mode of total appropriation of indigenous life and land, rather than the selective expropriation for profit-producing fragments. And so within settler colonialism, the most important concern is the land, air, water, and subterranean earth, or land for shorthand. Land is what is most valuable, contested, and required. And so this is both because the settlers make indigenous their new home and source of capital, but also because the disruption of indigenous relationships to land represents this profound epistemic, ontological, and cosmological violence. And the violence is not temporally contained in the arrival of the settler, but is reasserted every day of the occupation. So in some of the work Patrick Wolf did in defining settler colonial constructs, he emphasizes that settler colonialism is a structure and not an event. So in the process of settler colonialism, land is remade into property and human relationships to land are restricted to the relationship of the owner to his property, right? And they strip any of these epistemological, ontological, and cosmological relationships to land, and they're made pre-modern and backward and savage. So those are the rules, right? So we're not allowed to have a relationship with the land. You're only allowed to occupy it and to be the owner of that property. And so again, if you're thinking about that as far as Native people fighting for their sovereignty and their lands, then you really have to know that it is an everyday fight against this kind of everyday occupation. And so again, it just helps frame the perspectives of kind of the collective idea that we're working on here. I wanted to just mention these two slides. I thought it was very interesting. The late Thomas B. Hoffeller was a redistricting coordinator for the Republican National Committee and basically the Republican Party. And this is the title of his PowerPoint, what he learned from redistricting the hard way from the 2010 census. And I thought it was really interesting to think about this in the context of building power. This is the only slide I'm going to show you, but he wrote in here, just like the 19th century British foreign policy, they have no permanent allies, no permanent enemies, and only permanent interests. So self-interest binds and honor does not. So I would interpret that. And if you're thinking about even like the Roe decision, that their self-interest in getting that overturned didn't involve any honor whatsoever. And so when you understand that they're only interested in their permanent interests, then I think we just need to understand that what is our community's self-interest. And even if honor doesn't bind, you got to know who you're working against. It's like if they don't care about honor, then they can't be shamed into doing something different. There's probably some other political action that could make them change their interests, but they're probably not going to do it just out of the kindness of their heart. So it's always important to know that they're involved. This is for the redistricting. So if you're thinking about gerrymandering, then this is about the self-interest, about the governance of what happens in that state legislature and how they decide to control the people that live within these areas and geographic boundaries. So this is a quick fire outline of a gerrymandering. You can see these are the types of polygons that we draw for 9A and 9B to assess the level of gerrymandering happening. So this is just a good example to show you what we're up to. Gerrymandering is, broadly speaking, is any manipulation of district lines for partisan purposes. And so there's different types. There's racial, remedial, collusive, bipartisan gerrymandering. Not all of it's bad. Okay, but this idea of the most common kind of partisan gerrymandering is the most common kind. It's undertaken by the political party in control of a state legislature to help itself and injure its competitor, right? Other citizens that they don't want to participate in their democracy. So these come in two varieties, political and formal. So a political remedy, for example, might require the redistricting to satisfy a bipartisan set of commissioners, or that it be adopted by a supermajority of the legislature. And the remedy that this paper that I got this work from about looking at these scores is a formal proposal. And so in addition to adhering to criteria which mandates the representational districts be composed of contiguous territories and have equal populations, we suggest that those who define district boundaries must also be required to respect the third criterion, the constraint of compactness. And in their decision-making in North Dakota, they actually had the Polsby-Popper score. And so what we've been doing is working on trying to verify if that actually is the case, and they have the correct calculations. So without the ability to distend district lines so as to include or exclude blocks of voters who political loyalties are known, it is not practically possible to gerrymander. The diagnostic mark of the gerrymander is the non-compact district. So anyone who eyeballs a few legislative district maps quickly will learn to recognize gerrymanders, although admittedly it's with imperfect accuracy. But one needs not to rely on the seat of a pants reckoning to find the sort of non-compactness that implies gerrymandering. So what I wanted to do is just cover a couple of Supreme Court cases that I'll present in our story map here towards the end of Reynolds versus Sims. This is where the one person, one vote, and you can see this came from the civil rights era. And so essentially what there was being argued is that the state legislature violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so each county was entitled to at least one representative, and there'd be the same number of senators in the senatorial districts. And so the Supreme Court ruled in favor, stating that the legislative districts across the state must have roughly equal populations. And so that's what the state did. They're within plus or minus 5% all districts. And Baker versus Carr in 62, this was a lawsuit about the legislative districts hadn't been redrawn in 61 years, thus violating the state's constitution, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And then the case was dismissed, but later appealed to the Supreme Court, and they ruled in favor of stating that apportionment cases about this are justiciable. So in other words, they can rule on these things. But I think one of the more recent Supreme Court rulings on gerrymandering ruled opposite of that. So Eldridge Gerry is the famous gerrymanderer for almost 200 years until Baker versus Carr. Abusive partisan districting was a relatively simple matter. There is no constitutional requirement, and districts must be equinumerous, or malapportionment is what they called as their powerful tool for diluting the opposition's vote. So partisans need no other. So again, the advent of the one person, one vote changed the reapportionment to focus on partisan districts that have changed, and then creative gerrymandering has now replaced the older strategy of malapportionment. So that's how gerrymandering kind of got from the one person, one vote. They changed their strategy. So all districts must be equal in population. They do not need, though, have to have any particular shape or character, and they may be manipulated to suit partisan needs. So partisans, again, the reapportionment revolution coincided with technical innovations in computers. And so I'm going to show you some of that here in a minute. And then professional advice on effective gerrymandering is now a staple of the political consulting businesses. And so finally, just a couple more slides. Techniques for gerrymandering are simple. And so I just wanted to bring attention to how this works. So gerrymandering are simply and widely understood. In single member districts, only one legislator can win the election. So any support beyond the 50% plus one is therefore superfluous. And so from one party's point of view, we're talking about wasted votes. So the partisan map maker seeks to draw lines which concentrates the opposition's electoral support in just a few districts. That's called packing or cracking, while at the same time creating more districts where his own party commands a smaller but still safe majority. So that's called cracking. And the net result of that, many more of the opposition party supporters have their votes squandered by being thrown into contrived landslides. So that's an important piece to understand. A gerrymandering party can thus win more seats in proportion to its electoral support than it would if the district lines were drawn without regard for partisan considerations. So gerrymandering really inflicts harm on our democratic institutions, obviously, but it's easier to characterize than it is to prove. So that's why a lot of these cases go to the Supreme Court and they won't rule on them, because there's generally no accepted theory of how a legislature is supposed to reflect its constituents' interests and values. And gerrymandering violates the American constitutional tradition by conceding to the legislature's power of self-selection of any kind, and makes no sense under the Constitution, whose most arresting innovation was the dispersion of power. So centralizing these supermajority legislatures is really kind of an act of anti-constitutional democracy, especially if they're acting not in the best interest of their citizens. And so, again, if we're looking at this, gerrymandering can't be described purely from its manifestations. And a district map may look gerrymandered, but its wandering district lines may just have a nonpartisan explanation. There may even been drawn by most of the outcome disregarding criterion, or just a random walk of a computer program that simulated the boundaries. But again, nor may holistic districting be defined solely in terms of disparity between votes cast and seats obtained, or in terms of wasted votes, as these phenomena are common to all elections. So lots of people, quote unquote, get wasted, their vote gets wasted by how they design these. But that's common in many places. So gerrymandering in its illicit character is when state legislatures arrange for someone's vote to be wasted. So if they're actively doing it, then that's part of what gerrymandering is. And so ordinary voters, how do you describe and distinguish this from legitimate partisan activity? So ordinary voters believe that gerrymandering is one of the ways that scheming politicians frustrate the popular will. If you look at the Senate and the filibuster rule, that's an example of like minority rule. In our state, the state legislature tried to pass a 60-40 decision-making process in order for our referendum system to not be majority only, one person, one vote. They were going to try and require 60% of the electorate to vote on any constitutional amendment. Luckily, the voters came out and defeated it. The most obvious purpose of gerrymander is to diminish the political efficacy of certain voters' votes. So that's what we're looking at here for the native vote. And then the minorities party's votes are much more less likely to ever influence the elections. And so North Dakota got a taste of that when the natives voted in Heidi Heitkamp and then immediately passed legislation to create voter suppression. So it obviously, you can see the evidence. It didn't take very long for them to cook up a solution to try and get her defeated ahead of 2018. So finally, here's just the last thing, and I'll show a few gerrymandered polygons to just give you an idea of what it looks like. So in this case, why bother to vote? So in this paper that I've been kind of going through is the justification for voting cannot act prospective egocentric, that is utilitarian self-interest. Okay, that's a lot of big words. Rather, it must be axionomic or sociotropic, that is a gesture embodying a statement of preference about a way of life based on a purely ethical norm. Okay, but to translate this into English, a vote is a form of self-expression. And so it's a means to affirm the philosophy of popular sovereignty. It is a symbolic act of power that if you're participating in democracy, okay, no one can say, if you didn't vote, then, what can we say about being angry about having our district gerrymandered and county commissioners gerrymandering stuff so we don't get representative votes or we can't win an election. So that's kind of the idea here, is this symbology is endowed in what this democracy is about. So it's important that you participate. I mean, I don't know the much easier way to say it, but it is a symbolic act of power. And sometimes collectively, if you look at the voters in Kansas about the Roe decision, that they decided that their symbolic act of power created change and prevented their constitutional rights from being taken away. So it's not just elections have consequences. I mean, had it not been for this last election in 2020, I mean, the Democrats do have a majority in all houses of the Congress and the executive and judicial branches. So I guess it's kind of that the elections do have consequences. So sometimes we focus on the bad part about the enemies always being the people that are trying to destroy democracy, but elections did have consequences and people voted President Biden as their choice and alternative. And that's that. I mean, again, that's part of the democratic process. And so, you got to try the next time. Let's just hope people don't try to cheat. Okay. So, and again, gerrymandering at its core is complicated. There are core case law, again, that I mentioned, but what we're trying to do is study additional measures to better understand how these districts have been drawn. And then one acknowledges that gerrymandering is a pathology of democratic government. So there's no better reason to try and understand it than to see how it's working in real time in a real election. And so here's just some examples. Here's the 1812 senatorial district drawn by that the eldest Jerry. And so you can see they just drew it to gain an advantage. These are some of the compactness scores that the REOC score basically circumscribes a circle, and then you take the ratio of the area of the district by that circle, and that gives us a score about compactness. The Polsby-Popper score is about comparing the perimeter and the area of the district, and then the convex hull is basically using a minimum bounding polygon and comparing that to the area of the district. And so we were doing some training up at the Turtle Mountain stuff that we were doing, but look at this. I mean, this is how you could gerrymander something and see what the consequences of those are. So the folks at Native Vote were able to do a simulation and see how could you draw these seats. So for instance, if you look at this, if this is 100 voters and 40% are in the minority, then how could you draw this so they win 4 seats? So if you just drew it like this on the left, there's two orange safe seats and 1 toss-up. If you drew it the other way, with the lines going down and then over, you got 3 toss-up and no orange seats. Or if you draw it on the left here, that gives you 4 safe orange seats. But if you were to gerrymander as the minority, if you were given that power, you can see that the one on the right is how cracking and packing occurs, where you've created a majority of states, 6 out of 10 seats are minority governed. Therefore, they control the legislature. So that's essentially how it works, is they draw these with the intelligence of knowing how many people are going to get seats and who won't. So again, here's just my thanks to my contributors, Julia and Ellen, on working on getting a lot of these little polygons out that we can look at here in real time. Just after just showing a few of these. These are what I'll show you in real time in the GIS system of how we're actually working on some of these things for the last part of our discussion. So I'll take it back, send it back to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much for that. So that I was looking at those maps and the REACT scores, and they're at a 0.3 or 0.34. So how does that rate? Is that a good score to have? And what is the range? Should those scores, are they better closer to 0, or can you
Typically
that?
Typically what's happening is we're comparing like different, we're doing a ratio of a comparison of, let's say, if I draw, like, this is how we usually do things mathematically. In a mathematical system where we're making estimates of things, we usually tend to try and make something that we can do a comparison about, in this case, gerrymandering, that a unit circle is one of the easiest things that we can draw, and we know the formula for. So if we draw a circumscribed circle around that, then what we're doing is we're looking for the area, and I'll show this in just a minute, but essentially what we're doing is we're comparing whether or not is the district compact compared to that polygon. So if we look at the circle and it fits, so a REACT score would be 1 if the district was drawn as a circle. So if you took the area of both the district and the circle and they were the same, then you'd have a compact district. And so what we were getting at is in that Elder Jerry little picture that had this dragon and then the green, and how he just kind of drew it around like that. Okay, that shows you that it's that compactness. There's not a lot of compactness there because they're drawing a big long snake that's that doesn't fit really into that circle. And so that gives us some general ideas about how non-compact districts are being gerrymandered for partisan advantage.
Can you explain a little bit for our viewers what compactness would look like?
Compactness looks like, what I can do is I can show a few of these examples, and maybe I should just do that. So what we can do is I'll show you just a few of how this stuff works. And so essentially, if we just look at this, we can look at, so for instance, if you just look at the 9A and 9B, let's see, if we just look at District 9 and we look at the minimum bounding polygons, you can see that the blue is the district. That's the drawn district. Now, if we draw the convex hull, you can see it's very, if we look at the area here that's not blue, and let's just turn off the reservation for now. Okay, this is the area that isn't captured by that polygon. So that's how we're trying to look at measures of gerrymandering, from this idea that if it's really, really long, if we just look at this one, and we look at the District 9. Oops. So then if we're looking at District 9 here, you can see that in the gerrymandering, you can see how much area doesn't encompass, okay, that area. So that score is going to be much lower than the one where the natives in 9A are contained. And so again, it all depends on the geometry though, because if you do a convex hull, let's say, instead of the minimum bounding, then you're going to see that polygon fits nearly perfectly in there. And so if we're looking at those scores, then we can see, for instance, as a convex hull score, then some of these, so you can see that the convex hull, because of its geometry, taking its ratio means that this 0.85 and this 0.86, because of the convex hull, that they're very compact. So if you use the convex hull measure, then you're looking at more compactness. If we were to look at the REOC score, then we're looking at, see, 0.23 means that using a circumscribed circle, minimum bounding circle, means that there could be potential that's been gerrymandered in a way. And so all these different scores allow us just to see exactly by the district, like how compact are each one of these, and then how do we understand that from these perspective of where we're at. You can see 4A and 4B here are part of an at-large district, where the Fort Berthold Reservation is contained within this district here. But it's not necessarily as easy just to say something is gerrymandered. So that's one of the reasons why when we look at some of these things, we have to be mindful about what it is that it's telling us and why.
That's very interesting, and a lot of data to try to wrap anyone to try to wrap their head around. And so, does anybody have any questions? We do have a Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom interface. If you have questions, or if you'd like to raise your hand, I can allow you to speak on the platform for questions. Okay, so Dr. Robertson, we got about 20 minutes left in our webinar. Do we want to move on to the last topic?
Yes. Did you want to kind of set that up? I think
we're going to be talking about the power map with the one vote, one person, one vote.
Yeah, let's look at that. I think what we were going to discuss is a little bit about this, are elections free and fair and accessible, and then how do we ensure our relatives have the right to vote? And so what I think I'll do is to direct folks to, here's one of our examples of doing things in real time. Of course, this is a collective effort between our folks between North Dakota Native Vote. This is an ArcGIS story map. And so it's an interactive storytelling tool for us to understand the one person, one vote. And so you will be able to, I think if you, this is live now and it's public, so you can capture the link, and then you can look at, did you need the link?
No, we don't have it up on the website yet. We'll have that released tomorrow after.
Okay. So yeah, at some point you'll be able to read more about this, but essentially what this story map is studying this idea of the cost of voting between communities, which I mentioned before. And so a lot of this stuff, again, that I covered was to help kind of preface the idea that, you know, if we don't have some place to go to find this information, then it's hard to like educate yourself on how to do that. So this is also part of this collective platform that we're able to look at the Supreme Court cases that have to do with the one person, one vote or native vote. And I think what's happened in this webinar is you can see that a lot of the civil rights movement stuff that was happening back in the 1960s was really the first push for these equal rights in voting. And so it's a very interesting era to be living in, and that what we're fighting against, or what we're trying to mobilize, is for the representation of a democracy. However, one of the things you'll see in the Probate Statement is that although these court cases were battle for representation, that like I outlined, voting has become disproportionately difficult for our people. And so these voter suppression laws and areas where numbers of Native people live, they lack equitable voting infrastructure. And so again, what we did is start looking at like everyday numbers. So for instance, the cost of voting, right? The price per gallon at the end of July when we were constructing the story map is, it was $4.26 a gallon. If we were to look at voting by mail, all right, the post office in Cannonball, or no, Fort Yates is only is open for like 5 hours. So if someone has to drive from their home community, there are barriers to voting by mail too. We also covered this in the story map of the cost of the PO boxes. There's folks that have to share one mailbox because a medium PO box every year is $140. So in a complete census cycle of 10 years, you're talking the cost to get a PO box in order to get a mail-in ballot is going to be $1,400 every 10 years. And so a lot of this story map was designed to help folks just kind of interact with some of these things and just be able to look and see the cost of postage is 60 cents. But, if you multiply that by 10,000 people, then there's an actual money cost associated with that. The other thing that we were working on is integrating into WebGIS, this idea of looking at the routing. And so we could just go and look and see where the routes are to these areas. And so from the Porcupine, here's the routing from the Porcupine. You can see there's that's where people vote, and that's where the post office is. And so if we look at that from these perspectives, then we're able to like really see that there is a cost to vote. And so the Solon cost of voting, again, I kind of estimated it like per 100 voters, because again, some of these little communities, that's about how many people they have in the voting that's over 18. And so again, here's another interactive map that you can just interact with, and you can see the route, and you can see the locations of these different costs of voting and mileage and round trip costs. And then of course there's the Sioux County Democratic information, and again, part of this is just to help people understand that is it a free and fair election. So understanding these barriers and participating in democracy is paramount. And a lot of the grassroots work, this data is to help people better understand that if you want to help, then there are costs associated with helping people participate in the vote. And so again, down here is just some community resources, and there's a pledge to vote. There's a pledge to vote link for folks to go and take the pledge to vote for the folks here that are pledging to vote as part of the campaign for North Dakota Native Vote. And so what we're doing is trying to track voters and do our best to get out all of these kind of resources to folks. And so then this is part of our portfolio of story maps and the things that we're working on right now in real time. We're going to be working on a gerrymandering one. So we're just happy to share some of those things with you as the community, that you can see all of the digital infrastructure that's being created as a matter of, helping educate our people and our communities, and not just Native communities, non-Native communities as well.
Thank you for that, Dr. Robertson. We will have that map up on our website tomorrow. So check out our website, northdakotanativevote.org, ndnativevote.org. So we have a couple questions in the Q&A box. So the first one is, can you share a case or story where the data you presented swayed elected leaders to change voting rights or process?
Well, let me actually, I'd like to have you tackle, I'd like to get your perspective first, and then I'll make a comment.
So we are at the whim of these decision makers. They feel like that our electoral process is too simplified. They can you know, we're living in a very strange time in our history as humans. There's a lot of conspiracy theories that go into the voting process. You know, our elected officials don't trust organizations like us when we want to get engaged in these processes. I don't know why, but we are at the whim of these decision makers when they want to change the electoral process. And so, like I said in my introduction, last legislative session, there were multiple electoral election reform bills on the state bills that were at the state legislature. And because of the work, because of, you know, the monitoring of organizations like ours, we worked with our partners at the Native American Rights Fund and found that a lot of these bills were unconstitutional. And so that's one story where I can at least talk about how we've swayed decision makers to not attempt to change the voting rights processes here in North Dakota, because they are very cumbersome. Our electoral process is very complex, and if you don't have the right ID, if you don't have the right process for getting mail, you know, you might not be able to participate. And this is why we're here. And so, yeah, I'll stop there, Dr. Robertson.
I think it's like, I think what we're working on, well, what I'm broadly more working on is exactly that. It's like, how can you sway election leaders? But more importantly, it's like, if we're not participating, then we've got to find ways to be representative of a voting group. I mean, if you look back at that slide that said self-interest binds, well, it doesn't mean that we don't have to have honor in the work that we do, but we definitely need to work towards self-interest as Native people to create a collective voting bloc that may or may not have power broadly in many of these gerrymandered districts. But that's the whole idea here, is to develop a system where we can track voters. I mean, the voting now that we do in this country, whether you're a Republican state or Democratic state, that many elections come down to the precinct level of voting, and that there are possibilities that some of these state races, after analyzing a lot of this information and a lot of the voting data, really came down to just maybe a couple hundred votes for whether or not a district was going to be Democratic or Republican. And regardless of your political persuasion, it's like having a mix of our two-party system is actually a better thing, because when we have just one representation, then they're acting on their own accord, or that the balance of power in some of these states, in these swing states, is that there's a governor elected that's of the opposite party that can veto some of these anti-democratic things. And so, you know, it's like, as far as I go, I'm trying to stay as an analytics company, kind of neutral in being able to present folks like Native Vote and anyone else for that matter with intelligence that allows us to really do real meaningful campaigns to swing those election officials with real data that's been collected by someone like myself, who, you know, I hold a PhD in my field, so I'm a subject matter expert, and to do this in a highly probabilistic way to affect a policy outcome. So that's really the hope. So I hope we're able to do that and then expand that into more broadly the electorate, so we can track voting like in real time. And so that's really my goal as a company, is to be able to track voting data in real time.
I'd also like to add that this is very new. The project, at least here in North Dakota, this is, to my knowledge, the first time anything's being done like this, where we're taking data and policy and getting information from it, such as how the redistricting is impacting our people. We always have, as Native people, we always have intuitively believe that these systems are built to not benefit us. And so finding a way to make the data work and show and tell us the story is really what this project is all about. And so being that it's a new project, it's something that I'm very excited about. And I hope that we, you know, build out and get these answers to the questions that we've always asked. The second question, if you're ready to answer another question.
Yep, ready to go.
The second question is, in your opinion, how does this information help and affect our communities?
Well, data is power, and and really it's part of this idea that, if we don't design anti-gerrymandering solutions to like oppose the powers that be, then then we're just going along with, I mean, in our case, we're kind of reifying colonialism if we're not designing systems to help us be represented. And so I think how it affects community, I think that really is kind of in the eye of the beholder. And what I really was hoping is that when we build these relationships, let's say with the tribes of North Dakota, that we do it with care and we do it with high ethics. And um, and again, this could potentially help Native candidates find the right way to campaign in order to participate in the legislature. Even though it's probably cracked and packed and everything else, there are still opportunities for Native American candidates to take office. And that's what you really want to do. In South Dakota, a lot of the natives that were elected there did the same thing. They were there even though, it tends to be kind of a real colonial kind of violent place, but having Native American representation in there, we can't be afraid of that. You have to go and represent your county or your district and go represent them, because again, folks are going to be a little less inclined to do what they normally do because someone's not watching them. And so again, it's not really about surveillance. It's about that if we're not really talking about this truth to power and designing systems for us to be represented, then it's really, really difficult to have representation. And so, I think this could be a really positive thing on the community if we can design a system to get some wins. I mean, that's what this is about. It's about getting our people elected. And so we have the same right as anyone else to do that. And we have technology and platforms, and we have our kinship systems to rely on in order to do that in a good way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for answering that. We do have one more question. Would you like to answer the last question?
Sure.
All right. All right. So the question is, do you feel it is possible to move to open primaries versus party primaries elections with the data?
Well, I guess, again, like in South Dakota, one of the interesting things about South Dakota is they've got a constitutional process where you can petition and the voters can vote on a constitutional amendment. I think in North Dakota, I'm not sure what your system is like as far as that goes, but I mean, these open and party primaries, really the idea here is that in a supermajority such as South Dakota or North Dakota, there really needs to be there needs to be more of a structural idea that even though I've always joked that, if you're going to be you could join the I am a registered Republican but vote Democrat kind of position, because really what's happening is that the problem that's happening with this gerrymandering and the work that is going into this disenfranchisement thing is that these candidates that come up on primaries are certainly, some of them are very suspect and are very anti-democratic. So, in order to balance that equation, what's the way that you could do that? Well, if it's open, some states have open primaries where like it's the top two candidates, doesn't matter what party they are. But what happens if we have very, very rural places like this, that you have to build coalitions to work on the Republican side in these primaries to defeat the folks that are worst for the interests, because you got to remember that Democrats run unopposed. And so if you're voting for that Democrat in a primary, yes, that might be, you can definitely, that's something that is part of your party, of being part of that party. But we're not in very good times these days. So we've got to be strategic in learning and figuring out how to balance that power that's being completely misused as far as disenfranchising us as citizens. So, one of the things I would say is, what happens if you had a coalition of people that voted on the Republican side that were Democrats, and like what type of voting power would that look like? And it's being done right now. So there are people doing that, or people attempting to do that. So I think that's I think those are questions that are just ongoing that we need to figure out, like what that strategy looks like and who can deliver a win by doing that. You have to take off mute.
Not my first time doing that today, sorry. So we have a couple minutes left, and I know we have one more topic that we would like to discuss. If you want to dive right into that, are we?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll, what's that last question? Data is the new oil? Not a question, but a comment, but yeah, it really is. And one of the last things I'll just wanted to just share with you as far as like some of the work we're doing is here's a good example of looking at like Benson County. One of the interesting things I just thought I would mention is that I geoprocessed the precinct map, and you can see these are our electors at work. I mean, look at it, it's just like drawn with a marker to develop what the precincts look like. And so when I did that, we also created like how many votes came out of the primary. So you can see 500 votes came out of here, 121. And if we overlay the reservation, you can see that Benson County in itself is a full county, and there are all these votes that were cast during the primary. However, if you wanted to look at like from the at-large district, you can see that the district itself is split. So in District 15 is where all the native votes go into here. And then the majority of those other ballots go into this at-large district. So when you just look at that from this perspective, these are really the things that we're trying to get down to on the census level. And then if you look here, we can go in a little bit more granularly and look at the census tabulations. And so we can better understand this is the census data we've been able to capture. And so then we can make different estimates of what these numbers look like by each tribal census block group. And so I think that's kind of the next stages of what we're going to be doing here, is to really look and see what is the power of the vote happening in these types of districts. And so we've really been hard at work in getting some of that done for Sioux County and down here in Sioux County and 4A and 4B. And so that's kind of the next step that we're doing to produce some of these online maps for people to study.
Amazing. So much work. You make it look so easy. All right. So, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I think as we continue to do some of this work, I really do appreciate the opportunity to share my knowledge and to really put our best foot forward in advocating for our citizens and our people, and just as citizens, as our civic duty as American citizens. Regardless of our history, we still are citizens of this country, whether we're citizens of our nation or to the US. So it's important that we stress that and participate, because we've only had a few times to do that.
Yes, and comparative history of the, we've only had a few, not even 20 election cycles where we fully had the right to vote. And so thank you so much for providing this information. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and taking time to prepare for this webinar and sharing your knowledge with us. I'll give you a minute to wrap up and say your goodbye, say your farewell.
Well, thank you for everybody. I really do appreciate it. I want to thank North Dakota Native Vote, all the folks that work there, and they've been very welcoming to me in my site visits and the work that we do, very supportive of the ideas I bring to the table that help support their work. And I really do want to thank just the folks that came out today. It's just an honor to be able to share some of the work that I'm doing in these spaces, and that this high level data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence stuff isn't really going to go away soon. So I'm trying to find a way to utilize that for our benefit, for our community's benefit, and to do it in a good way and to always remember that our kinship system we're giving these things to have something, whatever that have is about our commitment to our communities to do good work and to do it in a good way and to be a good Dakota or Lakota or a good relative whenever we enter into these spaces for really the critical conscious work that we do to make our communities better for the future.
Thank you so much again. And thank you everybody that tuned in. We will have this recording available on our channels. Once it's edited, we'll share it out. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our presentation and ask questions. We really appreciate it. So thanks again, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.